Today I shall discuss the decline of the Mughal Empire, a highly debatable issue since the middle of the 19th century till almost today. After the English had taken over first Bengal and then almost the whole of India, their historiography, that is the writings of the English officials, dwelt upon the question, why did the Mughal Empire decline and fall? One of the major writers and high English official stated that the principal reason of the decline of the Mughal Empire was due to the orthodox, fanatical Muslim policy of the Emperor Aurangzeb, who had deliberately oppressed the Hindus. Or in other words, it was the religious policy of the Mughals that had led to the decline of the Mughal Empire, according to the English officials. This view was more or less corroborated by other highly placed English officials and writers, including Vincent Smith, whose book we had to read in our early days. Vincent Smith and then before that James Mill, they had devised what is known as the periodization of Indian history, Hindu period, Muslim period and British period. This periodization is more or less discarded nowadays, replaced by ancient, medieval and modern. But the basic objective of the English colonial officials was to show that the Hindus and the Muslims were in eternal conflict in India, and they are two separate races. They cannot be reconciled. This view obviously was done for a political reason of maintaining their own hold on India. From the early 20th century, one of the leading Indian historians, Jagannath Sarkar, began to write on Aurangzeb and finished it in 5 volumes, in which he had shown that the fanatical policy of the Emperor Aurangzeb was responsible for the Hindus to turn away from the Mughal Empire, and as a result of which the Mughal Empire had declined. This view he further elaborated in his another book called Later Mughals, the history of the Mughals of the 18th century India, in which he tried to show that the reason of the decline of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century was due to the weaknesses of the Mughal emperors, the intrigues of the nobility, as well as the religious policy of the Mughals. This was nothing new. William Irvine in his book had already delineated this kind of view, particularly emphasizing on the weakness of the moral character of the Mughal emperors. This view, on the one hand, the religious fanaticism, and on the other hand, the personal weaknesses of the Mughal emperors and the intrigues of the Mughal nobility, this view continued till independence. Even after independence, in many places, these views continued to hold. But from independence, some of the Indian historians began to write and began to search for deeper causes of the decline of the Mughal Empire. One of them was Professor Satish Chandra, who wrote Partisan Politics at the Mughal Court. Here he showed two aspects very briefly. One is that there was a great oppression by the Jagirdars on the peasants in the 18th century. He wrote between 1704 and 1741. So, great oppression on the Jagirdars, the nobles, on the peasants, because the aspirations of the Jagirdars or the nobles could not be met from the meager revenue of the Jagirs. This has resulted into the second aspect, the politics in the Mughal court, in which the Mughal nobles were divided. What is significant is that this division of the Mughal nobility is not based on religion. It is neither based on racial or communal lines. It is based on the personal affiliations, personal contact and friendship and relationship of the Mughal nobles. So therefore the division could not be said was due to the religious reason, either anti-Hindu or pro-Hindu. After the book of Satish Chandra, we had the book of late Athar Ali, who wrote on the Mughal nobility under Aurangzeb. Athar Ali's book is remarkable in many senses, and it has changed more or less the historiography of the Mughal Empire during our times. Athar Ali showed that the fact that Aurangzeb was anti-Rajput, particularly after 1670, because after 1670 he turned towards the Orthodox Muslims and became anti-Rajput, but he was not anti-Hindu. Instead of the Rajput Mansabdas, he had taken Maratha Mansabdas, because there were the Maratha wars going on. So the Marathas were recruited in large numbers, and as a matter of fact, Athar Ali had shown that the number of Hindus, percentage of Hindus in the Mughal administration in the higher level had increased very much from the time of Akbar to the time of Aurangzeb. For example, he said that during the reign of Akbar, there were 23% of the Hindus among the Mansabdas, among the nobles. By the time of the end of the reign of Aurangzeb, this number had reached 31%. So there was a very clear 8% rise in the Mughal Mansabdar system, in which the Hindus had got a good share. So therefore he argued that it cannot be said that Aurangzeb was anti-Hindu. He was certainly anti-Rajput because of the Rajput wars, and because of the Maratha wars he had begun to take the Marathas into the nobility. But beyond that, he said that what was happening from the end of the 17th century was known as the Jagirdari crisis. There he had followed to a certain extent the line given by Professor Satish Chandra that there was a crisis of the Jagirdari system in the sense of two senses rather. The one that not much revenue is coming out from the Jagir, which is the salary of the Mughal noble, and secondly that not many Jagirs are available. So therefore no new Mansabdas were being created because no Jagir is available. As a matter of fact, he quoted one of the contemporary writers who said that it is very difficult to get a Mansab, but it is almost impossible to get a Jagir. So therefore it was a Be Jagiri without a Jagir that has happened. Thirdly, he showed that earlier view of S.R. Sharma that the civil war was a civil war between Hindus and Muslims. The Hindus had sided with Dara and the Muslims had sided with Aurangzeb. Athar Ali had shown now that this is not correct. The number of Hindus on both sides were more or less the same. So therefore there was no such communal divide in the civil war between Aurangzeb and Dara. In a later article, Athar Ali had shown that there were certain other reasons for the decline. And he had compared the Ottoman Turkish Empire, Persian Empire, and the Mughal Empire, and had shown that all three had failed to take the advantage of the new technology that was coming. The technology of guns, technology of ammunition, many other technologies which were coming then. And he said that it was a cultural failure. Not much effort has been made, or not much research has been made since then to go through this very important aspect that has been highlighted by Athar Ali. Apart from these two, the third one which came out was done by Professor Irfan Habib. In his book, The Agrarian System of the Mughal Empire, between 1556 to 1707, that is to the death of Aurangzeb, he had tried to show that there was a great oppression of the Jagirs, great oppression of the Jagirdars on the peasants, for which he quoted the contemporary writer François Barnier, the middle of the 17th century, and he quoted also others to show, particularly the contemporary Persian documents, to show that this kind of oppression was so much that the peasants were deserting their villages and going to other areas. This kind of reasoning, which he had shown, was due to, it has a result and it is due to certain other reason. The result was, he said, was the revolt of the peasants, often led by the smaller zamindars, and there were a large number of revolts which he had given the list and the small descriptions as well in his later book, later second edition. Now, here he quoted particularly two European writers, one by Peter Mundy in 1670s, who said that in the Mughal Empire, one revolt or another is going on in some place of the other all the time. Another one by Nicolai Manucci, the Italian traveler, writing on 1700, he said the main problem is to confront the zamindars. In a document from Aurangzeb, we see that he was also aware of this, that the zamindars are not paying revenue. As a matter of fact, zamindars and fauzdars are becoming powerful, and as a result of this, there was less revenue, although technically the revenue had increased since the conquest of Bijapur and Golconda by Aurangzeb. It has increased by at least 23%. The reason of such oppression, reason of such revolts, according to Irfan Habib, was due to the crisis in the system of agriculture itself. And this crisis, particularly in the system of agriculture, he had developed and described fully in view of a contradictory source. The contradictory source was that during that, at the same time, there was higher commodity production, higher trade, yet this kind of agrarian crisis was going on. And he said finally that it was a class war, the class struggle, one might say, between the upper class and the lower class. But the caste struggle or the class war was hidden by two factors. One is the religious factors, what he called religious identity, which one could see in the revolt of the Satnamis in the 1670s in North India, revolt of the Matia in Broch in 1684, revolt of the Sikhs much later on at the end of the century and early 18th century. So therefore these religious wars had hit the class war which is said. Along with that, there were the class and the clan affiliation of the Jamidars. So therefore often the Jamidars who belonged to the upper class, they joined the peasants' revolt and it had become formidable. So therefore to Irfan Habib, it was a class war, it was the oppression of the Jagirdar, and it was the revolt of the peasants that combined to take the Mughal Empire in its path of decline. Along with that, we have another opinion given by Professor Oshin Dasgupta, late Oshin Dasgupta, who had worked on the merchants of Surat. He said that from the early 18th century, Surat port had declined, and he had given his arguments and evidences from English and the Dutch sources. There is no doubt that Surat had declined from the early 18th century. And he said it was due to the Maratha warfare in the hinterland, and also there were problems of the marketing in the Western Asia, the problems of the Persian and the Turkish empires, etc. He did not dwell much on the Dutch conquest of Southeast Asia, where the Surat merchants used to go, but that was also there. But the question is that what happened to the decline, after the decline of Surat? According to some, one could very briefly say that there were two results. One is the luxuries of the Mughal Empire had stopped coming, and second is the Bayana indigo, that is near Agra, that had stopped its production and its sale at the same time. Now, if we take the second one first, we see that it is not a very correct proposition, because by 1670, the Bayana indigo's days were over. We have the testimony of Bernier, who said that the Dutch, who were the principal buyers, who had their house at Bayana as well as at Agra, they had withdrawn. Actually, they had gone to Gujarat to get Sarkhej indigo. About the luxuries coming through Surat, it did not stop. It continued to come from the east coast. Actually, in the east coast there were two ports, Machilipatnam and Hooghly. Machilipatnam was practically closed by the vandalism of the Dutch by the end of the 17th century. So it was Hooghly and then consequently the rise of Patna that led to the import of the luxuries. We have detailed Persian description of Delhi just before 1739 to show that Delhi was still prosperous. Now, if we look at the Mughal Empire, we see that the financial crisis, which Jagirdari is actually in a broader sense, this was nothing new. In the early 17th century, after the death of Akbar and after the accession of Jahangir, he had very liberally appointed Mansabdars. So much so that by 1615, most of the Mansabdars were trying to find out Jagirs which they could not get. It has been estimated that between 1605 to 1621, the number of Mansabdars had doubled, but the Jagirs had not doubled, they remained the same. So therefore there is the question of the payment, and there was acute financial crisis. As a result, Jahangir had to reduce the salaries of the Mansabdars, and this kind of financial crisis continued till 1647 to almost to the end of the reign of Shah Jahan. By 1647, he could manage to reduce the financial crisis to almost its one-fourth. But it still remained, and it accentuated during the civil war for 3 years between Aurangzeb and Dara. So therefore it is nothing new. It was already there, latent, but suppressed, sometimes partially resolved, and therefore it continued and accentuated at the end of the 17th century and early 18th century. If we look at the 18th century, we would see that there were various political problems as well, apart from the economic ones. In 1739, Nadir Shah occupied Delhi, which had reduced the prestige of the Mughal Empire, so to speak, to everybody, including to the Europeans. Then in the middle of the 18th century, Ahmed Shah Abdali made several invasions. In the first one he was defeated and he fled. But then he became very bold and finally he occupied Delhi as well. So therefore, the 18th century was a century of major political upheaval. Then the Marathas began to dominate North India. The Rajput kingdoms refused to pay the revenue, and Emperor Shah Alam, it is said that his empire stretched from Delhi to Palam. This Emperor Shah Alam had to beg Mahadaji Scindia of the Marathas to get the revenue from the Rajputs, and he made the expeditions. He could not get this fully, and he had to pay a huge amount of money. So therefore the problem remains, and this problem was accentuated when the British came. They first of all took over after 1764. In 1765, the Devani of Bengal, Bihar, Orissa. Up to 1670, they paid revenue according to the fixed agreement to the Mughal emperor. But after that, they gradually began to stop it.